The Korean Mafia boss walked into the diner every night at the same hour. And every night the waitress serving him had no idea he was the reason 3 men were already dead. She thought he was just a quiet customer with sad eyes and a black car outside. She had no idea that the moment those dangerous men walked through that door looking for her, he would burn his entire empire to the ground just to keep her breathing. Welcome back, friends, to another emotional and gripping true-to-life story. Today's story will take you through fear, loyalty, and a kind of protection that costs more than money ever could. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from tonight. In a rundown but proud little diner on the edge of Los Angeles' Koreatown, wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered pharmacy, worked a young woman named Grace Lynn, 26 years old, an immigrant's daughter who had grown up watching her mother clean office buildings at midnight so Grace could finish school during the day. Grace waited tables at Auntie Soon's diner 6 nights a week, saving every spare dollar toward nursing school, a dream she had chased since she was 12 years old, and sat beside her grandmother's hospital bed, watching nurses move with a calm no one else in the room seemed to have. Grace's apartment was a small studio she shared with her younger brother, Daniel, 19, who was trying to finish community college while working weekends at an auto shop. Their mother had passed 2 years earlier from a heart condition that might have been caught sooner if she had ever been able to afford regular checkups, a fact that haunted Grace more than she let anyone see. It was part of why nursing school wasn't just a career goal to her. It was a promise she had made at a hospital bedside, a way of turning grief into something that might save someone else's mother one day. She didn't know that the quiet man who sat in the corner booth every night at 9 o'clock, always ordering the same bowl of kimchi jjigae, always leaving exactly the same tip, always watching the door more than his food, was a man named June Park, 38 years old, and the most feared name in 3 counties. June had built his organization from nothing, starting in the back alleys of Seoul as a teenager with no family and no options, clawing his way through a world that only rewarded ruthlessness. His mother had died when he was 7. His father had disappeared into drink and debt, and eventually disappeared entirely. By 14, June was running errands for men who would later become his enemies. By 20, he had buried 2 friends and made his first true enemy disappear in a way that still occasionally visited him in dreams he never spoke of to anyone. By the time he moved his operation to Los Angeles 15 years later, men twice his age flinched when his name was mentioned in a room. He ran shipping routes through the ports, real estate fronts scattered across 3 states, and a network of men who did not ask questions because they already understood the cost of asking. He had blood on his hands that would never wash off, and he had made peace with that a long time ago, the way a man makes peace with a wound that will simply never fully close. He told himself the peace was enough. He told himself a lot of things. What he hadn't made peace with was how empty the peace felt. June discovered the diner by accident one night after a deal went wrong 3 blocks away. A shipment delayed, a supplier getting nervous, the kind of small crisis that used to feel enormous to him and now simply felt tedious. He needed somewhere quiet to sit and think before his driver picked him up. Somewhere no one would recognize his face or ask why his knuckles were freshly bruised. He ordered food out of habit more than hunger, sliding into the corner booth without really seeing the room around him. And then a young waitress with tired eyes and a genuine smile set the bowl in front of him and said something no one in his world had said to him in over a decade. "Long day?" she asked. Not out of fear. Not out of flattery. Just out of kindness, the same kindness she offered every customer who walked through that door, whether they tipped well or not at all. June looked up at her, momentarily thrown by the plainness of the question, the absence of any calculation behind it. In his world, every question had an angle. Every kindness had a price attached, hidden somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to be collected. He searched her face for it out of pure reflex and found nothing there but simple human decency. "Long enough," he said finally, and it was the most honest sentence he had spoken in months. He said nothing else that first night. But he came back the next night. And the night after that. Over the following months, something happened that June could not have predicted, and would never have allowed himself to plan. He began to look forward to those 15 minutes at 9 o'clock more than anything else in his day, more than the deals that made him millions, more than the respect men paid him out of fear rather than admiration. Grace never asked about his scars, the ones on his knuckles or the ones in his eyes. She talked about her nursing school applications, about her mother's memory, about her brother's stubborn refusal to ask for help even when he clearly needed it, about the regular customers she worried about, the old man who came in every Tuesday and always ordered too little food because he was trying to stretch his social security check. June listened. He started leaving larger tips disguised as mistakes, folding extra bills into the receipt so it looked accidental. He started noticing things about the neighborhood that made his stomach turn. Things he would have ignored his entire life until now, back when noticing meant nothing to him because nothing outside his own operation had ever mattered. He noticed the group of men who had started coming around the block 3 weeks earlier. They called themselves the Vantos Crew, a loosely organized but violent group that had recently muscled into the neighborhood, running a protection racket dressed up as a community security fee. Every small business on the block had been visited, the laundromat, the nail salon, the family-run grocery on the corner. Most paid quietly out of fear, understanding that in neighborhoods where police response times stretched into the double digits, sometimes silence was survival. Auntie Soon, the diner's elderly owner, a widow who had run the place for over 20 years and buried a husband and a son in that time, had refused twice, telling them her diner had survived worse than street thugs. She'd survived a recession, a pandemic, a divorce, and a robbery in the 90s that had left a bullet hole still visible in the doorframe if you knew where to look. The Vantos crew did not like being refused. The first warning came in the form of a shattered front window at 2 in the morning. Auntie Soon swept up the glass herself before dawn, telling Grace it was probably just some drunk kids, though her hands shook as she spoke, and she kept glancing toward the street every few seconds like she expected someone to be watching. Grace didn't believe her, but she didn't push. She had learned a long time ago that some fears were better left unspoken, as if naming them might make them more real, might summon the very thing you were afraid of simply by giving it a name. June noticed the boarded window the very next night when he walked in for his 9 o'clock bowl of soup. He said nothing to Grace. He simply looked at the plywood covering where glass used to be, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and made a phone call before he even sat down, standing just outside the door with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice too low for anyone inside to catch a single word. What June didn't yet know was that the Vantos crew's interest in the diner had shifted from money to something far more personal. Their leader, a volatile man named Ricky Vantos, 29 years old, the kind of man who had spent his entire life being told no by people with more power than him, and had built an entire identity around never accepting that answer again, had eaten there twice that week and noticed Grace. Noticed the way she moved through the diner with quiet grace despite exhaustion written across her face. Noticed that she worked alone most closing shifts, that Auntie Soon usually left by 8 to tend to her arthritis, that the diner sat on a poorly lit stretch of block with a security camera that hadn't actually worked in over a year. He had made a comment to his men in the alley behind the diner, a comment that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with entitlement, the kind of entitlement dangerous men carry when they believe the world and everyone in it exists for their taking. Grace felt it before she understood it. A shift in the air whenever Ricky and his men came in, the way conversations at the counter seemed to quiet, the way even the ceiling fan seemed to hum a little differently, the way his eyes lingered too long on her when she refilled his coffee, the way he asked her name twice, as if testing how she'd react, watching her face for any flicker of fear he could file away and use later. She kept her responses polite but short, the practiced neutrality of a woman who had spent years learning how to be invisible to men who mistook kindness for invitation, who had learned that the fastest way to end an uncomfortable interaction with a stranger was to give him nothing to hold on to. One night, Ricky left a note tucked under his plate along with an unusually large tip. Grace found it while clearing the table and, out of habit, unfolded it in the back kitchen where no one could see her face change. She read words that made her stomach drop, words about seeing her after her shift, about how pretty she looked in that uniform, about how she should be nicer to a man who could make her life easier or harder depending on her attitude. The note ended with a phone number and the words, "Don't keep me waiting." She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the studio apartment listening to her brother's soft breathing in the bed across the room, replaying every interaction with Ricky, wondering what she had done to invite this, before catching herself and remembering, the way she always had to remind herself, that she had done nothing at all. Some men simply believed the world owed them access to whatever they wanted. What would you do if you were in Grace's place, trapped between needing this job and fearing the man who kept returning to claim it? She told no one at first, not wanting to alarm Auntie Soon, who already carried enough worry for the whole block, and not wanting to worry her brother, who she knew would do something reckless if he found out, something that could get him hurt or arrested trying to defend her honor against men who played by no rules at all. But June noticed. He always noticed. The next night when Grace set his bowl down, her hands weren't steady the way they usually were, and the smile she gave him didn't reach her eyes, a small performance that anyone else might have missed but that June, a man who had spent his entire life reading the smallest tells on the faces of dangerous people, caught immediately. Something happened, June said quietly. It wasn't a question. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen door to make sure no one else was listening, then, exhausted from carrying the fear alone for 2 sleepless nights, told him. Not everything but enough. The note. The comments. The way Ricky's men had started lingering near closing time like wolves circling something wounded, watching from across the street, timing when Auntie soon left and when Grace was alone. June's face didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. A stillness settling over him that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Do you still have the note? He asked. Grace blinked, surprised by the specificity of the question. I threw it away. Next time, June said. Keep it. He finished his soup that night in silence, left his usual tip, and walked out the door without another word. Grace assumed he simply didn't know what to say, that perhaps she had made him uncomfortable by sharing too much, that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary of their strange, quiet 9 o'clock ritual. She had no idea that the moment his car pulled away from the curb, June Park had already made 3 phone calls, and by morning every person in his organization knew Ricky Vantos's name, his address, his known associates, and the standing order that nothing was to happen to him yet, not until June understood exactly what they were dealing with. June did not operate the way people expected men like him to operate. He did not believe in reckless violence, not because he lacked the capacity for it, but because he had learned early in his career that rage made men sloppy, and sloppy men ended up dead or in prison. He believed in precision, in patience, in making problems disappear so cleanly that no one ever traced them back to their source. For over a week he simply watched. His men quietly gathered information, Ricky's routines, the gym he used 3 mornings a week, his financial backers, a small-time loan shark, 2 neighborhoods over who Ricky owed a considerable sum, the 2 rival organizations he owed money to but had been avoiding by hiding behind the fragile protection of a crew that was, in truth, far smaller and weaker than Ricky liked to advertise, and the warrant that had been sitting unserved for 8 months because of a corrupt beat cop on his payroll, who had been quietly burying the paperwork in exchange for a monthly envelope of cash. June didn't need to lift a single weapon. He needed only to pull the right threads, and men like Ricky Vantos, for all their bluster, were held together by threads far thinner than they realized. But patience has its limits, and dangerous men rarely wait quietly for consequences to arrive. In the days that followed, Grace tried to return to some version of normal, though normal now felt like something she was only performing. She started parking her car directly in front of the diner instead of around the corner where street parking was easier to find. She started texting her brother the moment she left work each night, a habit he questioned until she brushed it off as simple caution. She told herself the note had been an isolated incident, a drunk man's poor judgment, nothing more. She wanted very badly to believe that, because the alternative, that she was being hunted in slow motion by someone patient and cruel, was too heavy a thing to carry into an already exhausting life. Ricky, however, was not a patient man, and refusal, even quiet refusal, only sharpened his fixation. He began showing up at the diner more frequently, sometimes twice in a single week, always timing his visits for the hour when Auntie Soon had already left. He would sit at the counter and watch Grace work, saying little, but making his presence a kind of pressure that sat on her chest the entire time he remained. Once he accidentally brushed his hand against hers when she set down his plate, and though she pulled back instantly, the violation of it lingered on her skin for hours afterward, a phantom sensation she scrubbed at in the bathroom sink until her hands were raw. 10 days after the note on a Thursday, Auntie soon woke with a fever severe enough that Grace insisted she stay home, promising to close up the diner alone as she had done dozens of times before without incident. She locked the front door a little after 11, flipped the sign to closed, gathered her things, and turned toward the alley where her car was parked, only to find Ricky Vantos and 2 of his men standing in the shadows behind the dumpsters, blocking her path entirely. Told you we'd talk after your shift, Ricky said, his voice low. His smile the kind that never reached warmth, the kind that made her stomach drop through the floor. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. She reached for her phone in her apron pocket, but one of the men stepped forward and knocked it from her hand before she could dial, the screen cracking against the pavement, the sound of it small and final in the empty alley. She backed against the brick wall, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go, the men positioned to cut off every direction she might have chosen. You've been real cold to me, Ricky said, stepping closer, close enough now that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. And I don't like cold. I like grateful. Please, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, hating herself for how small it sounded even as she said it. Please just let me go home. You'll go home, Ricky said. When I say you can. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become the reason Grace never had to work another closing shift alone again. And the reason 3 men would never threaten anyone on that block again. A car door slammed at the mouth of the alley, the sound sharp enough to make all 3 men turn. Headlights cut through the dark, washing the brick walls in white light. June Park stepped out, alone, no weapon visible, his coat buttoned despite the warm night, his expression unreadable in a way that made even Ricky's men hesitate, some old animal instinct in them recognizing danger before their minds had fully processed what they were looking at. You've got exactly 10 seconds to walk away, June said, his voice flat and quiet, the voice of a man who had said far worse things in far worse rooms and meant every single one of them. Ricky laughed, though it came out thinner than he intended, a nervous edge creeping into the sound despite his best efforts to mask it. This isn't your business, old man. She is my business, June said. And something in the stillness of those 4 words made even the 2 men flanking Ricky take an involuntary step backward, putting a few extra inches of distance between themselves and their own boss, as though some primal part of them understood that whatever was about to happen, they wanted no part of standing directly beside Ricky when it did. Ricky, fueled by pride and unaware of exactly whose path he had crossed, reached toward his waistband. He never got the chance to finish the motion. 4 of June's men emerged from the shadows at the alley's opposite end, having been positioned there for the last 6 nights, waiting patiently for exactly this moment, the moment June had been careful enough to let arrive on its own rather than force prematurely. Ricky and his men found themselves surrounded, outmatched, and suddenly very aware that the quiet soup customer they had never bothered to notice, the man in the corner booth who left generous tips and kept his eyes down, was not a man to be tested under any circumstances. No shots were fired. No blood was spilled that night. June didn't need violence to win. He needed only the certainty of consequence, the kind that made even reckless men calculate the odds in an instant and realize they had already lost before the fight had even properly begun. Ricky Vantos and his men were escorted out of that alley and out of the neighborhood entirely, their car keys confiscated, their phones searched and photographed for evidence June's people would need later, though what happened to them over the following weeks, the sudden and intense interest from federal investigators into the Vantos crew's finances, the falling out with the rival organizations they owed money to who suddenly found themselves emboldened by Ricky's exposed weakness, the unraveling of the corrupt cop's protection once his own superiors received an anonymous tip about the buried warrant, was a story none of them would ever be able to fully explain, even to themselves, even years later when they tried to piece together exactly how their small, cruel operation had collapsed so completely in the span of a single month. Grace, shaking, slid down the brick wall until she was sitting on the cold pavement, her legs no longer willing to hold her weight, and June knelt in front of her without hesitation, his usually unreadable face now etched with something raw, something that looked almost like fear itself, though not for himself. I should have handled this sooner, he said quietly, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. I let my own caution cost you your safety. I am sorry, Grace. Grace, still trembling, looked at him with an expression somewhere between fear and disbelief, taking in the 4 men who had melted back into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared, the easy authority in June's voice, the way grown men twice his size had backed away from him without a single blow being thrown. Who are you? She asked. June was quiet for a long moment, crouched there in the alley beside her, the adrenaline of the last 90 seconds still humming beneath his composed exterior. Someone who should have told you the truth a long time ago, he finally said. And someone who is done letting people like that walk this earth believing they can touch what isn't theirs to touch. He drove her home himself that night, following a few car lengths behind her own vehicle to make sure she arrived safely, waiting outside her apartment building until he saw her bedroom light switch on, a silent signal that she was inside and secure. He didn't come up. He didn't ask to. He simply waited in the dark until he was certain, and then he drove away. What would you do if you discovered the quiet man who ate soup in your diner every night had just dismantled a criminal operation to protect you? In the weeks that followed, June told Grace the truth, all of it, without excuse or softening, sitting across from her in a booth long after the diner had closed on a night when Auntie Soon had gone home early and it was just the two of them and the hum of the refrigerator case. He told her about Seoul, about the choices that built his empire, about the blood that would never fully wash from his hands no matter how many years passed. He told her about the men he'd hurt and the ones he hadn't been able to save, about the version of himself he sometimes still recognized in the mirror and sometimes didn't recognize at all. He expected her to walk away. Most people, upon learning the truth about a man like June Park, ran as far and as fast as they could, and some small, defeated part of him had already prepared for that outcome, had already begun rehearsing how he would let her go without making it harder than it needed to be. Grace did not run. She sat across from him in that booth, silent for a long time, processing not just fear but something more complicated, gratitude tangled with caution, understanding tangled with disbelief. The enormous weight of trying to reconcile the man who had knelt in an alley checking on her safety with the things he was now describing in flat, unflinching detail. "You could have just told me to be careful," she finally said. "You didn't have to do all that. You didn't have to become that for me." "I know," June said. "I did it anyway." "Why?" June considered the question longer than she expected. "Because you're the first person in 15 years who asked if I'd had a long day and meant it," he said. "I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Or from you." Their relationship, if it could even be called that in the beginning, remained slow and careful. Grace made it clear she would not be a prize claimed by a dangerous man simply because he had saved her from other dangerous men, that gratitude and affection were not the same thing, and that she needed time to understand which one she was actually feeling. June, to his own surprise, respected that more than he had ever respected anyone's demands in his life, more than the fear his own men showed him, more than the deference of business partners who needed something from him. He began stepping back from the more violent corners of his business, delegating what he could to lieutenants he trusted, distancing himself from operations that once defined him entirely, not overnight and not completely, because a man does not unmake 15 years of choices in a matter of weeks, but the direction of him had changed, quietly and unmistakably. Auntie Soon never learned the full truth about what happened in that alley, only that the Vantos crew never returned, that her diner's front window was mysteriously repaired within a week by an anonymous benefactor, along with a new security camera system installed free of charge by a contractor who refused payment and wouldn't explain who had sent him, and that the quiet man in the corner booth had somehow become a permanent, protective presence in her waitress's life. She noticed the way Grace's shoulders relaxed a little more each week, the way the fear that had settled into her posture slowly began to lift, and she said nothing about it beyond occasionally sliding an extra dumpling onto June's plate with a knowing look that made him almost smile. Grace's brother, Daniel, took longer to come around. He was suspicious of June in the way any protective younger sibling would be suspicious of a stranger who suddenly held enormous influence over his sister's life, and it took months of careful, patient conversation, and one long night where June quietly helped Daniel fix a transmission problem on his car without ever being asked, using knowledge from a childhood he rarely spoke about, before Daniel's guard began to lower even slightly. A year later, Grace was accepted into nursing school, the tuition quietly covered under an anonymous scholarship fund June had set up months before she even applied, structured carefully through a legitimate foundation with a legal board and real oversight, so she would never know it came from him unless she asked directly, which she eventually did, sitting across from him in that same booth, and which he did not deny. "You didn't have to do that either," she said. "I know," June said again, the same two words, the same quiet certainty behind them. She still worked occasional shifts at the diner, not out of necessity anymore, but because Auntie Soon had become family, and family doesn't disappear the moment things get easier. June Park never became a good man in the way fairy tales describe good men. His past did not evaporate. The consequences of the life he built did not simply dissolve because he fell in love with a woman who served him soup with more kindness than he'd received in 15 years. There were still nights he came to the diner with tension behind his eyes that he never fully explained, still phone calls he stepped outside to take, still a world he moved through that Grace understood she would never be allowed to see the entirety of, and had, after long consideration, decided she didn't need to. But he became, slowly and imperfectly, a man who protected instead of only destroyed, who built instead of only took, who finally understood that power meant nothing at all if there was no one worth using it for. The moral of this story is simple but powerful. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the room are not the ones announcing their power, but the quiet ones sitting in the corner, watching, waiting, deciding what and who is worth protecting. And sometimes real change doesn't come from becoming someone entirely new, but from finally finding a reason to use what you already have for something good. If this story moved you tonight, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more emotional and gripping true-to-life stories, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet strength often protects the loudest. Let us know in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most, and don't forget to tell us which country you're watching from. We'll see you in the next story.